I'm live. It is 7:15 p.m. on Saturday, July 2nd. Just came in here to, I was going to say to make some brief comments, but you know me, I have trouble being brief. Excuse me. I saw a post on a friend's page that got me to thinking because it shows how some people are not willing to learn from the past, I guess, or acknowledge the past and where we are now and the transitions and the changes, the evolution that has been made. And that's unfortunate. And a big part of the reason for that, I think, is our modern education system, also our mainstream media, our politicians who want to keep us angry with each other and button heads and fighting amongst ourselves. So they tend to benefit from this sort of thing. Let me go to the page and tell you what it is. Now, you should know that this friend of mine, I'm not going to give you his name, is a black man. He lives here in America. He's an American. And he posted a meme of an eagle drawn in red, white, and blue, stars on it, stripes on it to look like the American flag. Happy 4th of July weekend, he says. Okay. And one of the respondents to this post said, it wasn't happy for my people at all, meaning black people, slaves. Okay. All right. Yeah. I can't really argue with that. I don't imagine it was very happy for them back when they were slaves. I know I wouldn't want to be a slave. I know if I was a slave, I'd be doing everything I could to fight against it, as pretty much like I do now. So I guess in one way, I understand that sentiment. In another way, it's like, okay, look, we know slavery existed. We know slavery's bad. I haven't met anybody in my lifetime who thinks we should have slavery again, who thinks slavery was a swell idea, and who doesn't give a damn about what happened 150, 160, 170 years ago. So I guess what bothers me about this attitude amongst many Americans is they act like nothing's changed. Like we haven't evolved, we haven't learned anything, we haven't made any changes at all. And I have to tell you that irritates me, because all that does is continue to stir up animosities and anger among people that doesn't need to be there. It serves no purpose. It helps no one. So I thought what I'd do in an effort to try to educate some people, enlighten some people, make them aware of the changes that have been made, is to talk to them about what has changed over the years and how it changed. Number one, we know that when America was created, this being Independence Day weekend, that despite all the rhetoric in the Declaration, and despite the Constitution, what it says, that there were still people in this country, black people, Africans, many of them, or descendants of Africans, who were not free, who were not enjoying the same rights as white people. And understand, too, that even among the white people, there were different classes. There was the educated elite class. There were the poor dirt farmers. So there wasn't equality among a lot of people. But the words, what did the words say? What did they portend? What did they allow to have happen? Yes, compromises were made in order to create the United States of America. We all know what they are. I'm not going to get into those right now. Had those compromises not been made, one could legitimately ask, would there have even been a United States of America that could evolve over the years, in which changes could be made? So yes, slavery existed. Now, was slavery strictly a white American versus black African thing, or white people in America the only people in the history of man who have ever owned slaves? No, of course they aren't. Now, anyone who knows anything about history, world history in particular, knows that, or should know that. And if you don't, shame on you. You didn't pay attention in history class. Or maybe if you went through the public school system in this country, you weren't really taught. So I guess in some sense, maybe you're not really to blame if you're not taught these things when you're in school, and you have no desire post-schooling to learn anything on your own. Well, I guess it's understandable that you wouldn't know these things. So in America, slavery ends with the end of the Civil War. Now, we could go into the history of why the war was fought. Was slavery the primary issue? No, it was not. And there's plenty of evidence to substantiate that. Was it a issue for a lot of people? Yeah, it was. And without question, the end of the American Civil War saw the end of slavery. We had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, which took care of that. Now, of course, we know about the Black Codes. We know about Jim Crow laws. So while slavery had been abolished as an American institution, racism had not. So we know what happened as a result of that. And one wants to believe that racism was strictly a Southern thing. I can offer many examples of books that you can read that would abuse you of that thought. But again, you have to want to learn. You have to be willing to read these things. You have to accept that the people that you hate or want to hate and want others to hate, while lionizing others as paragons of virtue and morality, is really not accurate either. Racism was rampant throughout the country, North and South. So don't get yourself confused into thinking that one region of the country was less racist than the other. And slavery was abounded in northern states as well. Again, this is not my opinion. These are historical facts, and I can recommend books for you if you're willing to read them. So, 1865, we end slavery in the United States of America. We know that Americans are not, or the United States of America, let me be clear, because when you say the Americas, you got Central America and South America, and included in that often is the Caribbean and the islands and island nations in that area. But white Americans in the United States are not the only people who have ever owned slaves. In fact, a lot of freed black men in America own slaves. So it's not just a white thing. But where is slavery today? Do we have slavery today? Let's ask Ghislaine Maxwell. Anyway, yes, there is slavery today throughout the world in different countries. Of course, nobody wants to talk about those because it doesn't suit their political agenda here in the United States of America. And that's what it's really all about. It's not about real freedom for people. It's about political agendas and what can be used to fundraise and to beat up other people with. When did other countries that had slavery end it? Well, let's look at that. There's a couple of lists here we can look at. This is from Reuters, and it's dated actually March of 2007. So this goes back a few years, but let's look at this. All right, Britain marks 200 years on March 25th since it enacted a law banning the transatlantic slave trade, although full abolition of slavery did not follow for another generation. So the Brits, who were a big part of the Atlantic slave trade, ended the Atlantic part of the slave trade 200 years ago. This is from 2007. So they still had slaves in England and in British colonies, but they ended the slave trade across the Atlantic. Now, moving along, let's see, just some brief historical dates and what happened. 1444, the first public sale of African slaves in Lagos, Portugal. That's in 1444. Moving along. 1510, first slaves arrive in the Spanish colonies of South America, having traveled via Spain. So we're seeing right now some Spanish-speaking European countries are participating in the slave trade. And keep going here. 1777, state of Vermont, an independent republic after the American Revolution, becomes first sovereign state to abolish slavery. So here in the States, Vermont, a northern state, was the first to abolish slavery. All right, 1780s, the transatlantic slave trade reaches its peak. All right, 1787, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, founded in Britain by Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson. And we know that eventually Great Britain is going to abolish slavery. Let's see, 1811, Spain abolishes slavery, including in its colonies, though Cuba rejects the ban and continues to deal in slaves. 1813, Sweden bans slave trading. 1814, Netherlands bans slave trading. No, understand, they're saying they're banning slave trading. If you're still a slave in these countries, well, you're still a slave. They're just not going to be going to the west coast of Africa and bartering for new ones. 1833, Britain passes the Abolition of Slavery Act, ordering gradual abolition of slavery in all British colonies. Plantation owners in the West Indies received 20 million pounds in compensation. So Great Britain ends slavery, but they actually compensated slave owners using the taxpayers' money, of course. 1819, Portugal abolishes the slave trade north of the equator. Well, baby steps. All right, let's see. 1848, France abolishes slavery. 1851, Brazil abolishes slave trading. 1861, the Netherlands abolishes slavery in Dutch Caribbean colonies. So you're starting to see the progression here. 1886, slavery is abolished in Cuba. 1888, Brazil abolishes slavery. 1926, the League of Nations adopts Slavery Convention abolishing slavery. So you see how it took other countries a while before they abolished slavery. Now, the difference, of course, is they didn't have wars. They didn't have a civil war in which over 600,000 people died to make that happen, but they ended slavery. Point being that it was obvious to a lot of people, becoming ever more obvious, despite all the people who were trying to make excuses for it, that slavery was evil, it was bad, it should be stopped for a whole host of reasons. And so people started to come around. New generation after new generation, people learn a little more, they get a little smarter, they understand things a little better, they realize what slavery is, they realize that Black people are not subhuman, that they are real people, and they should be treated as such. So these things evolve. I mean, let's face it, guys, the human being on planet Earth today is not the same human being of 10,000 years ago. Not in a lot of ways. I would hope over this period of human history that we've learned a few things. But sometimes those things take a while. I mean, sad to say, we aren't just born being geniuses, right? You have to learn these things. All right. But is there still slavery in the world today? Well, let's look at World Atlas, and there's no date on this, but it's worldatlas.com. There are 40.3 million slaves in the world today. North Korea has the highest prevalence of slaves in any country. Well, that doesn't surprise me. But let's look at some of the other countries that currently have slavery. Number 10 on the list, Iran, with 16.2 per 1,000 people. Number 9, Cambodia. Number 8, Pakistan. 7, South Sudan. Where is Sudan? Let's look at a map. Mauritania. Where is Mauritania? Afghanistan. Central African Republic. Burundi. Eritrea. I hope I'm saying that right. It's a country on the country found in the Horn of Africa. Eritrea. I hope I said that right. Anyway, and of course, number 1, North Korea. Notice that I think half of this list is in Africa. So what are the chances that it's black people owning other black people? And if that's the case, if slavery is still going on in these countries, where are you, American politicians? Where are you, American activists? Why are we not hearing from you? I remember apartheid in South Africa and how all these politicians and all these activists here in America were just losing their minds over apartheid, and we must ban products from South Africa. We must stop sending things to South Africa. We need to boycott products like Coca-Cola and others that go to South Africa to end apartheid. Well, where are you on the slavery issue? How can we never hear from you on that? Is it not important anymore? I'm just curious. I mean, you're the ones that make all the noise about this stuff, and yet when it comes to certain other subjects, you're really quiet, and you hope we don't notice, but I do notice. I notice when you're loud and obnoxious, and I also notice when you're really quiet about something and you just don't talk much about it. All right, 6 countries where slavery still exists. This is from Oxygen True Crime. This is dated 2018. I've said some of these already. Mauritania, India. India is the home of the largest number of enslaved people in the world. An estimated 18,354,700 people, or 1.40% of the population, are reportedly living in modern slavery. India. So it would be Indians enslaving other Indians, wouldn't it? Unless a bunch of white people just moved to India and then created slavery for themselves, right? Because if you listen to the typical American politician or the typical American activist or the typical American school teacher, you'd believe that the only people in the history of mankind on this planet who ever owned slaves or created slavery were white people. And the only people they enslaved were people of color. But that's not true. And you need to know that's not true. China, Uzbekistan, Libya. Where's Libya? What continent is that on? And of course, North Korea again. So my point is, slavery hasn't gone away. It's still out there. And yet here in America, politicians and activists want to talk about only the slavery that occurred in America over 150 years ago. You don't even hear them talking about slavery going on around the world today. The same people who wanted to boycott anything and everything going to or coming from South Africa because of apartheid don't say anything about slavery. And on the list I read earlier, on both lists, over half the countries mentioned are on the continent of Africa. Well, now who inhabits the majority of the continent of Africa? Is it white folks or is it people of color? My point being, slavery is bad. I don't care who you are. It's wrong. I don't want to be a slave. Do you? Do you think slavery's okay? I sure don't. I wouldn't want to be a slave. But people talk about it today, even today in America, like, oh, the only people who do it is white people. And the only people they make slaves are black people. How does that help? Slavery ended in this country over 150 years ago. So how does continuing to beat that dead horse help anybody? It's okay to remember it. I'm not saying we should just wipe it off the chalkboard of history and forget about it. Absolutely, we should remember it. And we should talk about it. And we should accept that it was bad then, it's bad now. But 150, 170, 200 years ago, the culture was different than it is now. And we've learned things over those decades. We're a little bit, I'd like to think, we're a little bit smarter now. Although I question whether some people are. So learn. The reason we don't have slavery now in the United States of America is because, well, two things. One, the end of the American Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments. I've already mentioned those. But two, anyone who's read the history of America understands that slavery was on the wane by that time anyway. Not just because it wasn't profitable, but because people, the culture were starting to change. They were starting to understand that, number one, while they look different than us, black people are still human beings and they shouldn't be treated that way. The religious community, the abolition community started stepping up and making more noise about it and saying to people, this needs to end. And there were people who were hearing them. Now, granted, it may not have been moving as quickly as some would have liked. Certainly, if I were a slave, I would hope they'd end it yesterday instead of waiting another 5 or 10 years. But the point is, it was on the way out. It may not have been going as quickly as they would like, but it was working. Now, did we need to have a war to end it? That's a whole nother debate. But I would submit that we could have waited. If we had waited a little longer, it would have ended itself. Politically, we wouldn't have had to fight a war. But again, the war was fought for a lot of different reasons, and low down on the list was slavery. So again, this continuing to refer back to slavery of 150 plus years ago, historically, it's important to remember those things. We should teach it in our schools. There should be museums. There should be monuments or statues to those who helped to fight slavery and to those slaves who survived and would make something of themselves later. Here in Richmond, Virginia, I think it would be great if we had a monument to John Mitchell Jr. I think there are other people. He's not dead yet. And in fact, he himself has said he doesn't want any statues to him while he's still alive. And that's Douglas Wilder, the first black governor of Virginia. There should be a statue or a monument in his honor. Rather than taking away from, we should be adding to. But that's because I'm a history nut. And I like history, and I think we should know history. We should remember history. We should learn it. We should teach it. And not political history, not politically correct stuff. History, what really happened. The information's out there. You just have to want to find it. So I would say to this fellow on the Facebook page, no, I agree with your statement that, you know, back when slaves still existed in America, July 4th was probably, or Independence Day, was probably not a holiday they thought very highly of. It was ironic that here I am a slave and you're celebrating your independence. Even without an education and the ability to read, one has to scratch one's head and go, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But things have changed. Our Constitution was written so that things could change. We have an amendment process, and that amendment process should be slow and ponderous and difficult, because you don't want to make changes in your government just willy-nilly, spur of the moment, because you're mad today or you're sad tomorrow or you're happy the next day. It should take time so that you have time to discuss it and hopefully look at all the pros and cons before making a final decision. And in that vein, I would ask you, Mr. and Mrs. America, have you ever made a decision at the spur of the moment because you were angry or because you were really sad and then regretted it later? Well, imagine doing that at the level of a nation. So yes, changes can be made, changes should be made, but they should be slow, difficult. They should take time. There should be much debate about it and try to weigh everything. Slavery has been over in this country since 1865, 150 plus years ago. Racism took a little bit longer to get rid of, and you're never going to get rid of it completely. Sad to say, there are always going to be people of every color who don't like people of another color for whatever reason. That's human nature. You can't make a law that's going to change that. But on Independence Day, on Monday, July 4th, let's look at where we are now as opposed to where we were then. And you, within your own heart and your own mind, try to decide if things are better or not. I would submit they're a lot better. And we can discuss in what ways if you care to. But it's not 1865 anymore. We have learned some things. A few generations have passed. And as a culture, as a nation, as a people, we have evolved. We've gotten better in some ways. I would submit we've gotten dumber in others. But that's another video for another time. But slavery is not an issue here anymore. No one alive today was an American slave. No one alive today was an American slave owner. But there's still slavery going on in the world, Mr. and Mrs. Liberal, Mr. and Mrs. Activist, Mr. and Mrs. Politician. If you want to make some points for yourself, if you want to make some noise and fight against something, there's plenty of countries out there that have slavery today, as I'm sitting here making this video, that you could be talking about, and you could be protesting, and you could be demanding boycotts and changes be made, just like you did with apartheid in South Africa. But you're not doing that. And I have to wonder why.